I am Ken Levinson, the CEO of WITA, the Washington International Trade Association, your host for WITA's Friday Exchange. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting in a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WITA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. We are recording this week's episode on Thursday, August 7th at 6:30 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade news might have changed. There continues to be a lot of news on trade in the past week and just the past 24 hours with a slew of new tariffs going into effect. But on today's episode, we're going to look at the issue that dwarfs them all and will likely have a bigger impact than the deals with Europe, Japan, Korea, and all the others, China. Since joining the WTO in 2001, the impact of China on the world trading system has been immense, and the ramifications of any U.S.-China trade deal will be likely more impactful than just about any other trade moves being made by the United States and its other trading partners. Today, we are joined by four people to help us unpack where things stand on U.S.-China trade and where we may be headed. Chris Padilla, a senior advisor at Brunswick Group and the former Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade. Stephen Vaughn, partner at King & Spalding and the former general counsel at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in Trump 1. And Jeff Moon, founder of China Moon Strategies and the former assistant USTR for China Affairs. And of course, our moderator and frequent host of the podcast and discussion leader today, Wendy Cutler, the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute and the former acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Wendy?
Well, thanks, Ken, and I'm thrilled to be moderating this session with such a great panel. So as Ken mentioned, with now the reciprocal tariffs in place, all eyes are turning to August 12th, the date when a decision needs to be made whether to reimpose high tariffs against China or to roll over this deadline. So let me start with that question. Maybe, Steve, I can start with you. What are the prospects for rolling over the tariffs on August 12th? What would need to happen? And do you think we're on track for a rollover?
Yeah, I mean, I think Secretary Bessent has already signaled that that's likely what's going to happen. I think that the administration felt like the talks went well in Stockholm, and they feel like things are moving in a favorable direction. They did a similar thing for Mexico, where they gave them an extension in a situation where they felt those talks were proceeding in a favorable direction. So everything I'm seeing and hearing from the administration makes it likely that they're going to give themselves a 90-day extension.
Jeff, Chris, what do you think?
I think it's certain that there will be, and I think that there will be extensions all the way to the summit in late October, probably on the margins of APEC. That's what they're aiming for. You can see the choreography of what's happening. There are various confidence-building steps that are being taken. Rubio met with Wang Yi. Rare earths have been resumed. Chinese student visas, H-20s. There was a merger approval. And there are perhaps other steps that they're talking about as well. And Secretary Lutnick said today that he also thought that there would be a rollover. So I think it's baked in.
So, Chris, why hasn't it been announced?
The president likes to keep us all in suspense. And, you know, we're talking on the evening of August 7th, but who knows what will happen between now and August 12th. I agree with Steve and Jeff. I think the likelihood I don't know if it's certain, but I think it's more likely than not that it'll be rolled over. You know, it was interesting that the Chinese announced basically in Stockholm that there had been an agreement to roll over, but then Secretary Bessent quickly said, well, we got to check with the president, and the president's keeping his options open. That's a common theme. The president keeps his options open on tariffs until the very last moment. But because of what Jeff mentioned, I think it's more likely than not because the president wants to see a summit later this year, and I think this is part of that.
Mhm. Yeah, so let's move on to the summit. Jeff had already mentioned that it looks like the president, when he goes to attend the APEC leaders meeting in Korea, that maybe he would do a stop in China, or maybe he would just meet with Xi Jinping on the margins of the summit. But he has said, I believe last week, that in order to do so, he would want something to announce, or a trade deal. So maybe we can talk a little about the prospects for a trade deal. We've all negotiated them. And Steve, you were instrumental in the phase one negotiations. The trade negotiations take time. And my understanding, if I look, when I look at the calendar, I think we have about 2.5 months until APEC. And even though the two sides have been meeting nonstop, it seems that they've really just been focusing on ensuring a stable supply of critical minerals and magnets to the United States. I might be wrong there, but at least that's what reports suggest. So, Jeff, maybe I can start with you here. What do you think the prospects are for a deal? And given the short time frame, what can we realistically expect? Is it going to be like an agreement with commercial announcements? Are we going to see other things? Over to you.
I think there would have to be some kind of a deal. Trump has already said that that's mandatory. I think that's probably the same for Xi Jinping. There are two tracks here. There's a trade track and there's a diplomatic track, that all summits are involved with. Trump, his priority is the trade track and trying to get accomplishments with the Chinese. Xi Jinping and the Chinese are more interested actually in the diplomatic track and solidifying the relationship without really making any concessions. So I think the deal would basically be the phase one deal all over again. That consists of purchases. There'll be a tariff number, but purchases, maybe investments, some industrial policy crumbs along the side. But the US really can't press too hard because Trump has exhausted his tariff leverage. 3 months ago, when he threatened an effective embargo and then backed off, he's lost his leverage, and the Chinese now have the leverage because they've found rare earths as a magic bullet and something that the West absolutely needs. So the whole dynamic of the trading relationship has changed over the past 3 months and reduced the possibility to really get an agreement that gets into the industrial policy issues that are at the heart of the US-China relationship.
Just to take an issue with you on the phase one deal, although everyone paid attention to the purchases, the way I recall, there were like 50 pages of Chinese concessions on agriculture and IPR and currency and other issues. So, Steve, maybe I can turn to you since you were part of that team. What do you think can be accomplished by, a late October, early November meeting between the two presidents?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at sort of what they've done with the EU and Japan and Korea in recent months, I think you can see that what they may have in mind by a deal may not be what we sort of traditionally think of as a deal, right? In other words, one of the things that we've sort of seen is that the president is very comfortable making these sort of broad, almost term sheet type agreements, and then letting the bureaucrats continue to work on the agreement sort of after he's made the original announcement at a high level. And that's what he did with the Europeans, and that's what he did with Japan, and that's what he did with Korea. And I could certainly see them doing something like that again. I want to disagree a little bit here with Jeff. I don't think the Americans feel like they're at a huge disadvantage vis-a-vis China. I think when they look at China, they see an economy that is extremely dependent on exports and really has a desperate kind of need to keep pushing these goods out into the world. And now that as this U.S. market is closing to them and as they're going to face more difficulties transshipping into the U.S. market, thanks to some of the other deals the president has made, I think they think that President Xi is going to come under more and more pressure to find kind of alternative ways to get his economy moving. And I think that's why you're seeing Secretary Vaughn talk about how they really need to change their model. They need to move in a more consumer-oriented direction. So I think what we're going to see is this, Wendy. I think we're going to see less emphasis on some of the pressure to get China to change its economic model and more emphasis on, do we see China shifting in ways that would be better for the global economy? Are they moving in a more consumer-oriented direction? Are they doing less to sort of flood markets worldwide? Are they willing to rein in some of this excess capacity that we've seen? I think those are the type of things that the president and his team are going to be interested in seeing, because they're trying to figure out a way, is it still possible for the US and China to sort of fit into the same world economy? And I think that's really where the focus is right now.
Yeah, China just released its trade numbers for the month of July, and even though exports to the United States decreased, they increased substantially to the EU, to Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. Jeff, I'm going to give you the opportunity to respond to Steve's comments.
Well, actually, I agree with most of what he said. And I think that, as I said, I think Trump has exhausted his tariff leverage. He needs to look for new tools as we move forward with China. And one of those tools is attacking the transshipment issue. This is something that's been referenced in several of the deals, but really hasn't been fleshed out in any significant way. It's very complicated. It would be hard to crack down. The US needs to be in the lead and needs to get allies. But that is the way to confront China's overcapacity issue. I do not think, however, that negotiations with China are going to get China to change its course economically. In fact, they're now preparing their 15th five-year plan, which is going to be rolled out formally probably in the fall. They're already saying that they are going to continue with investment and manufacturing and overcapacity as a matter of policy. So instead of trying
Don't
to
use that term overcapacity, though, do they?
They don't, but they do. I mean, Xi Jinping has recently made remarks about why is it that every local government now is building EVs and involved in AI? They've recognized that there's at least overcapacity there, though they haven't recognized that it's happening overseas.
That's what I mean. Yeah. Chris, over to you. We go back years negotiating with Japan, and there were efforts then to secure kind of these long-term structural adjustments from the Japanese in trade negotiations. I will say now we weren't very successful, but I'm wondering if you see any utility in trying to push these structural issues. And then the other thing I just want to ask you then, what might China want in this negotiation? Because I personally think, unlike the phase one negotiation, which was largely one-sided, the U.S. got all of the benefits, China got very few. It seems that it will be different this time around.
Well, I agree. I think it will be different. So a couple of things. As Steve mentioned, the president likes to do these very high-level informal deals. I refer to them as bar napkin agreements. I mean, it's like you sketch out the terms on a bar napkin and
At the exchange.
at the exchange. There you go. I don't even know if they have napkins at the exchange, but in any case, these are nothing's written down. There's no text. We've seen no text on any agreement really, other than the UK agreement. They consist of a social media post and maybe a fact sheet. And then almost immediately there's disagreements on what's been agreed. Will the Chinese go along with that? Are they prepared to make that kind of a vague agreement? I doubt it. Particularly if it's going to involve a summit between the leaders. Putting Xi Jinping in that kind of a situation would not be good for the career health or physical health of Chinese officials, I think. So I think it has to be a little bit more meaty. Now, what will be in it? As Steve was talking, I was remembering you remember, Wendy, the Structural Impediments Initiative from way back when.
SII.
An effort to get Japan to make structural changes in its economy. Didn't go all that well. I think it certainly would be great if we could get the Chinese to agree to increase domestic consumption and reduce their reliance on export markets. But I doubt very much that a trade agreement would be successful in that. So my guess of what it's going to look like is mostly a purchasing agreement. And as we saw with phase one, the Chinese didn't really live up to that purchasing agreement. Now, there's reasons why. COVID intervened, so on and so forth. But even before COVID, they weren't living up to the purchase agreement. My guess is there will be a purchase agreement, and then maybe they'll go back and look at that 50 pages from phase one that did, as you mentioned, Wendy, had a lot of commitments about no forced tech transfer, better protection of IP, and so forth. Maybe they'll revive some of that. The Chinese did do some of those things, at least in law, but in practice, as always, it's unclear. I think on the Chinese side, they're going to want more than they had in phase one. I am assuming they're going to want stronger commitments on the removal or at least putting a ceiling on tariffs, which they didn't really get last time. And I think they're going to ask for things as well on export controls. With the US having opened the door now to basically trading national security export controls in trade deals, I'd be shocked if the Chinese didn't make an ask in return for a summit meeting on something, whether it's AI chips, quantum computing, advanced robotics. There's any number of areas where the US has got export controls in place, even semiconductor manufacturing equipment, where the Chinese could ask for liberalization. And as any of us who've sat across the table from a Chinese official know, the first thing in their talking points is always, if only you'd relax your export controls, the trade deficit would disappear. So they're gonna use those talking points again because now they know that we're prepared to bargain on these things.
So, Steve, do you think export controls are on the table now that we open the door for them, given that in the past couple of months we did impose some export controls, but then lifted them for China as we pursued a deal with them? Are you concerned?
No, not really. I mean, I think that I don't think the Trump people are all that interested in doing much transactions with China at all. I think their kind of working assumption is that going forward, we're going to keep this tariff on China at around 30, 40%, something like that. I think that's going to pretty much just be a permanent part of life. I think they're going to get better and better and better at stopping the transshipments, and that'll sort of slowly, shut down China's access to this market. I think they're fine with that. I think they've sort of set this, they've found a process whereby the US economy can kind of adjust to sort of slowly pulling away from China. And then I think, in terms of kind of all we have to, we don't have to go to Europe and ask Europe to help us with China. Europe's going to help on their own because Europe doesn't want to be flooded by China. Japan's going to help on their own. Korea's going to help on their own. None of these countries are going to sit there and kind of let China just run roughshod over their markets. So I think, honestly, what the Trump team, the way they think about it is, all they really have to do is just kind of keep the status quo, and China will sort of get slowly more and more and more squeezed as they face, barriers around the world. So I don't see the Americans being in a position where they're going to make a lot of concessions to China. I see these talks being very similar to the type of talks that they've had with the EU and Japan, where, they want China to sort of accept that this is the way it's going to be going forward. And Chris makes a good point. President Xi may not be willing to do that, in which case they may not get very much done at this time. But I certainly don't see the Americans being in a position where they feel like, we've got to make all these concessions to keep China happy. I just don't think that's what they're thinking about at all. And I don't think they particularly have much hope or interest in, trying to reform China's economy. So I think you're going to see them basically say, again, we'd like to announce something similar to where we are with the EU, to where we are with Japan. We'd like to kind of regularize this thing and show that you guys are ready to kind of live with us in this new way of doing stuff. And we'll see if China agrees to that. And if they do, great. And if they don't, well, we'll see how much longer they can keep exporting to the EU.
Jeff, turn to you now. How's Beijing approaching all of this? How interested do you think they are in a deal and in a meeting with President Trump, particularly if they can't achieve a deal where they're getting something, or the deal is so vague that they don't want to put their leader up against Trump in fear that he may claim other things were achieved?
Yeah, I think the Chinese are a lot more stubborn than Steve does. This is at least the third trade war we've had with China. In 93, 94, President Clinton threatened to cut off MFN if they didn't improve human rights. They did nothing, and Clinton backed down. In 2019, they walked away from a 150-page agreement, and then we got the phase one deal, which they didn't necessarily perform on. And then I already mentioned the threat of an embargo where the president backed down. So the Chinese think that if they just sit tight, they'll be just fine. And I think that they will not be dictated to. I also think that the US has now stepped on a slippery slope with this rare earths issue. The Chinese have realized that they do have an effective choke point, a choke point on ongoing operations and technologies in the American economy, as opposed to some of the technology restrictions the US is imposing, which is about prospective technologies and prospective operations. The Chinese are going to use rare earths to respond on all kinds of issues going forward. Every time they feel pinched, it's just going to be inconvenient in MOFCOM to process those approvals of the licenses, and we're going to come back over and over to that. I think a couple other things we haven't mentioned also are, remember, summits are also diplomatic, not just trade oriented. The Chinese say, and they have said in these negotiations, that respect is the first thing that they want and expect. I don't think Americans appreciate how important that is to them. And then there's always Taiwan. Any Chinese diplomat will tell you that Taiwan is the most important and sensitive issue. We need to watch the Taiwan issue very carefully going forward to a summit, because that could easily derail things. And that's why the president denied William Lai the transit through the United States recently, because the Chinese successfully linked Taiwan to these trade negotiations.
I just want to make
build on
wait,
that
wait,
point?
when you get wait. I
Yeah,
just
go
want to say
ahead.
one. I just want to make one quick point, which is that nobody has more confidence in the stubbornness of China than I do. And so I want to just. It's not that I think they're not going to be stubborn. I expect them to be extremely stubborn. I just think that the U.S. negotiators are more confident than Jeff thinks they are. My view is that this rare earths card is a card that you can only play so many times. And eventually the Americans are going to find alternatives, even if that means you have to do some sort of industrial policy, or you have to, I think the notion that the Americans are going to sit here and allow themselves to be blackmailed over rare earths for a very long period of time is not accurate. And if that's sort of how China is thinking, I think they're going to make a huge, huge blunder.
Well,
Chris,
I have to say, I think the power dynamic between the US and China is different than it is with any other trading partner. So I don't think I mean, if the Trump negotiators are thinking this is just going to be like another EU deal, I think that's a miscalculation. The rare earths issue is a significant point of leverage, and it will be at least probably through the end of President Trump's term. I mean, I know
and why is that? Because it just takes time,
it
right?
takes time. I mean, the Defense Department has a very ambitious program called Mines to Magnets, which has set a goal of self-sufficiency in certain defense-related rare earths by 2027. That's pretty ambitious. I think most analysts would tell you it's at least 5 years, probably longer, before we're in a position to be much less dependent, particularly for commercial applications of rare earth magnets that are used in things like automobiles and phones and whatnot. But look at the evidence, though. I mean, if President Trump really believes that China's in a weaker position, we didn't approve the transit for William Lai. We've essentially suspended all new national security export controls, having reversed the H20 controls on the NVIDIA chips after only 3 months in effect. We are not imposing, apparently, as of today, any secondary sanctions on China, which is the largest purchaser of Russian oil, with the president having just yesterday announced a 25% tariff on India for doing exactly that. But China is getting off scot-free. So, you've got a body of evidence here that suggests that the president really wants a deal and is prepared to make concessions to get one. And the Chinese, who are the world's best negotiators, they know this. And they know that they have more leverage than the European Union does. And the fact that the president ratcheted up the tariffs to an embargo level and then backed down because he knew he was going to trash the, availability of goods at Walmart and Target, that also had an impact. So I agree with Jeff. I think the power dynamics here are different. And that means that whatever deal we may get, I don't think it's going to be a bar napkin agreement. I don't think the Chinese will go along with that, and we'll see what it looks like. My guess is, I think the Chinese from the very beginning of this administration were willing to do a purchasing agreement, to basically try to buy the president off. I think they're still willing to do that. I don't know that they're willing to make structural changes in their economy, which is what we'd like to see, because frankly, that's not how the Communist Party thinks.
Let's turn to the issue of increased Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States. We've heard the president once in a while allude to that. We also know that there are many restrictions through our CFIUS process and through other state laws and other legislation that's working itself through. Steve, do you think that there is an appetite for some limited, targeted Chinese foreign direct investment in the United States? You think this is something that the White House might be interested in?
I mean, again, I don't really understand what the White House would be getting for that, right? In other words, I mean, all these things that, Jeff and Chris seem to think that the Americans are just going to go over there and sort of roll over to China and sort of beg for mercy. But nobody is really, what I think Jeff and Chris are overlooking is you pay a tremendous political price in the United States if you sort of humiliate yourself in a deal with China. If you sit down and you agree to something and you allow, commentators in the US to say, wow, Trump got crushed in these negotiations. He really gave away the store. I mean, then you really hurt yourself politically. And I just don't see the administration doing that. So I think all these ideas that, Trump's going to go begging for a deal, or Trump's going to go pleading for foreign direct investment, or Trump's going to,
No, I didn't say pleading for it, just to be clear.
My point is, I don't think any of this is particularly appealing to the administration. I mean, my own view is this. I think the president is being very careful to give President Xi space to make a deal. I think he is going to some of the points that Chris is talking about. I think he is trying to send a message to President Xi. We are not encircling you. We are not building alliances against you. We are not, working with the people of Taiwan against you. And therefore, you should come to the table and make a deal. But I think that's not the same as saying, oh my gosh, we got to have these rare earths, so let's give China whatever they want. So I think that I don't expect them to do a lot on foreign direct investments, to be honest. I think that they understand that would be a political weapon that would be used against them over here and would really hurt them. So I don't think they'll do that.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, do you think that the Chinese see it the way that Steve has explained in terms of how, what the administration is conveying to China?
Well, specifically about FDI, the president's goal is to bring investment to the United States, increase domestic manufacturing, and employ American workers. So there are possibilities for Chinese investment. The problem is that it has to be in non-sensitive sectors that offer some kind of commercial benefit to China, but do not allow the Chinese to have leverage over the US supply chain. And there are examples of investments that meet those criteria. One that comes to mind is Fuyao in Ohio. These guys make auto glass. They invested hundreds of millions of dollars. They hired several thousand American workers, and they reclaimed unused factory space. I'm not familiar with the company, and I'm not vouching for the company, but I am saying that a deal along those lines would be welcome. I don't know how much money would be involved and whether that would be enough, to be significant, or if the Chinese are really that interested. But there are opportunities out there.
I agree with Jeff. There are a lot of sectors that are off limits, either because of CFIUS or for other reasons. But there are some areas, I think retail, hospitality, if the Chinese want to own hotels, general services, things like that, low-end electronics or basic manufacturing. Remember, Haier owns GE Appliances, and they employ lots of folks making washers and dryers in Kentucky. And that's been a pretty successful investment for both GE and for Haier. Commercial real estate is another area, although can't be near anything that's sensitive, but maybe commercial real estate in cities. So there are areas where I think it could make sense. The question is, do the Chinese want to invest in those areas? I mean, they've wanted to invest in lots of areas that we aren't particularly interested in. We haven't talked about the TikTok deal and whether that would be part of any summit agenda. I assume that it would be. I mean, it's still hanging out there. The president keeps extending the deadline, so that might be part of a summit agreement too. I don't want to say that I think the president is desperate for a deal, but I'm struck by the fact that he, at the moment, is being more accommodating toward China than he is to some other major trading partners,
including India and
including
Switzerland.
India. And the fact, I mean, trust me, as you know, Wendy, the Indians notice this. They're saying, wait a minute, you said we were a strategic ally in the Indo-Pacific. You just smacked us with another 25% on Russian oil. The Chinese over here, your adversary, buy more than we do. What about them? There's no good answer for that other than the president wants an agreement with China and wants to go and have a summit meeting. And so I just think that's a different dynamic than Ursula von der Leyen flying to his golf course in Scotland to have a meeting. I think it's different.
Yes, and I think there's a completely different explanation for that. In other words, I think what the president is doing is he's showing everybody that, he is getting increasingly agitated about the situation with Russia. He has also expressed real concern about the BRICS and some of the things that they've said about the relationship with the dollar and some of the things that are going on there. I think he is also sending a signal to India and to the rest of the world that he is not interested in sort of paying other countries or giving benefits to other countries to form some sort of an alliance against China. So I think those are all true facts, but I don't think any of that means that they are necessarily inclined to show weakness in the face of China. I think they understand the political stakes of standing up to China. I think this is the most realistic group of people we've had in terms of sort of understanding China, understanding what China wants, understanding what China's role in the world. I think they enter into these meetings with no illusions at all. And so I think it's going to be very tough, and it'll be interesting to see if Chris is right and China's not interested in sort of anything, at kind of a high level term sheet type arrangement. Then my guess is we won't see any type of an announcement, because I certainly don't think the president's going to be interested in writing out a whole big trade deal between now and October.
So in our remaining few minutes, can we just touch briefly upon kind of this third country issue? And in many of the trade deals that we're negotiating with other partners, my understanding, there is kind of this economic security bucket where I'll put the transshipment issue in that bucket, but also we have asked certain countries to align with our export controls or to put in place investment screening mechanisms, et cetera. But it's interesting because when these deals have been announced, we don't really hear anything about these other provisions except for transshipment. So are there other areas? I mean, are these areas being negotiated? What are you all hearing? And two, with respect to this transshipment issue, do you think that we're going to be seeing new strict rules of origin to help kind of implement that provision? Because again, the transshipment, we hear 20%, but 40% tariff if transshipped, but there are no details about how that's going to be assessed. So who wants to take that one?
That's a huge question on the minds of companies, I can tell you from companies that I talk to, because if the issue really is, illegal transshipment, you ship your box, you change the label on it, or, that's fraud. It's illegal. It's always been illegal. If that's what we're talking about, okay, fine. Why do you need a 40% tariff?
Well, right. That should just be illegal, right?
It's illegal.
Yeah. So maybe that word isn't precise.
So that's what worries people. Does transshipment really mean that there's a rule of origin that says if you've got 20% Chinese content in your, transistor radio made in Malaysia, that's quote transshipped and we're going to hit it with 40%. I think that's the concern, and I think it's a real concern. The president has said the transshipment provisions apply. I think he has said they apply universally, not just to the countries in Southeast Asia, which suggests that maybe this is more about just illegal, changing your country of origin markings. If that's what it is, it's fine. But again, because we don't have the details and no text, it's creating a lot of uncertainty. And I think that's a really big question mark out there, because the difference between a 20% and a 40% tariff is pretty big.
Yeah, but I think, Wendy, that's exactly what it means, right? In other words, I think that the intention is to say, to a country like Vietnam, okay, we're giving access to you, we're not giving access to China through you, right? So in other words, this is your deal. It's not China's deal. China is going to have to come negotiate its own deal. So I think it is. I don't think it's going to be substantial transformation. I think it is going to be some sort of rule of origin along the lines of what Chris is talking about. And I think these rules are going to, as time goes on, I think these rules are going to get stricter and stricter and stricter. And I think countries are just going to have to choose whether they want to have access to the U.S. or whether they want to deal with China.
So just to follow up, Steve, so are you saying that if a Chinese company actually set up operations in Vietnam, hired Vietnamese workers, used Vietnamese input, that would then be subject to like the 20% tariff that Vietnam has been assigned?
I think what Chris is saying, I haven't clarified that, and I don't think they're in a big hurry to clarify. I mean, I think that they are letting people know, and I think this is going to become even more vivid when they start sitting down to do the new rules on USMCA, right? I think it is going to become increasingly clear, if you have a deal with the United States, you are not allowed to share that deal with China, period, full stop.
Yeah, but you have to define what that means, Steve.
Well, and I agree. And I think
companies have to know, because otherwise they can't.
On the one hand, right, there's a certain amount of to the extent the uncertainty discourages them from using China, it's helpful from a U.S. perspective. And I think over time, we're going to get a lot more clarity. But for example, do I think that BYD is eventually going to be able to build an auto plant in Mexico and take advantage of the rules of origin in the USMCA? No, I don't think they're going to be allowed to do that. I think these rules are going to get stricter and stricter and stricter as time goes on, because I just think that these two countries are sort of slowly pulling apart from each other.
Yeah, I want to strongly agree with that. I mean, the big picture here is deindustrialization. The Chinese are telling us in their official doctrine that they want to continue manufacturing, that overcapacity is a state policy, and predatory pricing is coming our way. The Europeans are very concerned about this, as are we. And I think we are going to have to go to some kind of content requirements and change rules of origin to adapt to all of this. This is the big game coming forward that we're going to be fighting. And what really concerns me is the negotiating style that we're seeing right now is very conflictive and disrespectful to a lot of our allies. And in order to make this successful, we will not only need to get those allies to say they're committed to this, but to actually really mean it and really enforce it. And in order to do that, we really need to change the tone with which we're talking to some of these countries. But I do see this as the future of the bilateral relationship.
Okay, we're going to just about close. Steve or Chris, any final words?
Yeah, I mean, I'll make one point. When we used to have all these discussions about Smoot-Hawley and how Smoot-Hawley was a mistake for the U.S., one of the points that was made, and I agreed with, is that when you're an export-oriented country, like we were in the 1920s and 30s, it is very risky to put up trade barriers around yourself, because then it gets harder to export into these other countries. I think that is the dynamic that China is going to run into more and more and more. They are a country that lives off of exports, and yet they will not open their own market. And I think that going to Jeff's point, yes, we'd like these other countries to work with us, and I think they are going to work with us just out of their own self-interest. As that flood of goods that's been headed our way starts getting redirected toward these other countries, those countries are going to act to protect themselves as well. And China is going to start to see these barriers going up all around the world. And that, I think, is sort of ultimately what's going to bring them to the table. It probably won't happen by October, but it will happen eventually.
Chris?
I would just say if we all agree that China is the principal strategic competitor, strategic threat to the United States in the long term, both militarily, politically, and economically, then we ought to be working cooperatively with allies to deal with that threat. That means things like cooperating on critical minerals, for example. It means cooperating on export controls. It means cooperating on overcapacity and Chinese overcapacity in places like steel. It means building alliances like the Quad. But the president's trade policy, which is focused maniacally on trade deficits and tariffs, is alienating almost every one of our allies. And if the long-term goal is to deal with the principal threat, which is China, I think we're doing ourselves a lot of damage through the tactics and the transactional approach that the president is taking.
Look, we could go on forever. This has been an excellent discussion. Thank you to our panelists. This is Wendy Cutler. Thank you for joining us. We will see you next week on WIDA's Friday Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WIDA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WIDA's Friday Exchange.